What if I told you that somewhere in this country, there's a therapist sitting on a secret so disturbing she hasn't told a single colleague the full truth? A secret about patients who walk, talk, and laugh like us, but aren't actually one of us. If that sentence just gave you chills, stay with me, because by the end of this story you'll understand exactly why she couldn't sleep for weeks. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell, because this story only gets stranger from here. This is the story of Dr. Helen Marsh, a respected clinical psychologist who believed she had seen everything in 20 years of practice, until 3 ordinary patients showed her something that wasn't supposed to exist. Helen Marsh's office sat on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone, the kind of quiet, tasteful space designed to make people feel safe enough to say the things they'd never said out loud. She had built her career on careful listening, on noticing the tiny details other therapists missed. That skill was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. Her new patient, a 30-year-old graphic designer named Owen, arrived for his intake session looking perfectly normal. Khakis, a faded band t-shirt, an easy smile. But within the first 10 minutes, Helen noticed something odd. Owen never blinked at the same time twice during a sentence. His blinking pattern seemed almost calculated, like a habit he was performing rather than a reflex he couldn't control. "Tell me what brought you in today," Helen said, keeping her tone light. "I keep losing hours," Owen said. "I'll be making coffee, and then it's 2 hours later, and I'm standing in a parking lot I don't recognize." Helen wrote this down. Dissociative episodes were common enough, especially in patients with unprocessed trauma. But Owen's description had an unsettling precision to it. He didn't describe confusion. He described absence, as though something else had been operating his body while he was gone. "Do you ever feel like someone or something is watching from inside your own thoughts?" Owen asked suddenly. Helen's pen paused. "Why do you ask that?" "Because lately I feel like I'm a passenger," he said. "Like I'm renting space in my own head." Over the following weeks, 2 more patients arrived with eerily similar stories. A nurse named Priya described borrowed time, moments where she would find herself somewhere unexpected with no memory of getting there. A quiet accountant named Marcus described a recurring sensation of his own thoughts not feeling like his, as if someone had written them for him and slipped them into his mind while he slept. Each of them used different words. Each of them had a different life. But the underlying shape of their experience was identical, and that consistency was what finally made Helen's professional instincts scream that something was deeply wrong. She began keeping a private file. Not a clinical file, something separate, almost like a detective's notebook. She wrote down every odd detail, the unnatural blinking patterns, the strange gaps in memory that always lasted in increments of exactly 40 minutes, the way each patient occasionally used outdated slang from decades they hadn't lived through, then immediately seemed embarrassed and corrected themselves. One night, reviewing her notes at home, Helen noticed something she had missed. All 3 patients had mentioned, almost in passing, a recurring dream of a vast underground space filled with rows of glass cylinders. Owen called it the archive. Priya called it the storage room. Marcus simply called it downstairs and refused to elaborate further. Helen's scientific training told her this was coincidence, shared cultural imagery, nothing more. But a colder, quieter part of her mind told her to keep digging. She began researching cases of so-called host syndrome, a fringe theory circulating in obscure psychiatric forums about consciousness transference, about minds being placed into bodies that weren't originally theirs. Most of what she found was speculation dressed up as science, easily dismissed. But buried in an old academic paper from a since-shuttered research institute, she found a reference to an experimental memory mapping program from nearly 15 years earlier. A program that had recruited subjects using the exact same intake criteria her 3 patients had described during their evaluations: childhood relocation, no living immediate family, no close friendships, financial vulnerability. People easy to recruit. People easy to make disappear from notice if something went wrong. Helen decided to test a theory. During Owen's next session, she asked him to recall his 10th birthday in vivid detail. He answered immediately, fluently, describing a cake, a backyard, a dog that wasn't his. But when she asked a simple follow-up question, what the weather had been like that day, he froze completely. Not hesitated. Froze, the way a video buffers when the connection drops. I don't have that part, he finally said, his voice flat in a way she hadn't heard from him before. It was the first time Helen felt real fear in her own office. She brought the same exercise to Priya and Marcus in separate sessions, asking for sensory details from supposed childhood memories. Both of them experienced the same strange gap, vivid narrative, but a complete absence of texture, smell, weather, sound. As if their memories were scripts rather than experiences. As if someone had written the important plot points of a life and left the small human details blank because nobody had bothered to fill them in. Helen began to suspect these weren't simply patients with psychological disorders. She suspected she might be treating something that had been built to resemble a person closely enough to pass, but not closely enough to survive deep scrutiny. She reached out to a former graduate school colleague, now working in neuroscience research, and described the case anonymously, without names. He laughed at first, assuming she was pitching a screenplay. Then she described the 40-minute memory gaps, and his tone changed entirely. There was a project, he said carefully. Years ago. It got shut down fast and quietly. They were experimenting with consciousness duplication, copying a mapped neural pattern into a synthetic substrate housed in an organic passing shell. The official line was that the project failed and was discontinued. Unofficially, a few people I know think some of the early prototypes were simply released. Cut loose when the funding disappeared, with false memories implanted to keep them functional in the world. Helen felt the floor of her understanding tilt sideways. Released to do what? Just to exist, as far as anyone could tell. Low-risk subjects. Easy to study from a distance. Easy to lose track of if something went wrong. That night, Helen couldn't stop thinking about the glass cylinders from their shared dream. If her 3 patients were prototypes from this discontinued program, the dream wasn't a coincidence. It was a memory fragment bleeding through from whatever they had been before they were given human lives to wear. She decided to test the most disturbing possibility of all. During her next session with Marcus, she asked him directly, "Do you know what you are?" For a long moment, Marcus simply looked at her, his expression utterly still in a way that human faces rarely manage to hold. Then he answered, his voice quiet and oddly gentle. "I know what I'm supposed to think I am. I don't always know what's true underneath that." Helen asked the question she had been most afraid to ask. "If I told you that you might not be human in the way you believe, what would you want me to do?" Marcus considered this with the same careful precision he brought to every accounting problem in his actual job. "I'd want you to tell me anyway," he said. "Even if it changes everything. I'd rather know." That single sentence undid something in Helen. Whatever these 3 were, biologically or otherwise, they were capable of wanting truth over comfort. They were capable of choosing honesty even when it cost them peace of mind. If that wasn't a human trait, she didn't know what was. Over the following month, Helen made a decision that risked her entire career. Instead of reporting her suspicions to authorities who might simply erase the evidence, and possibly the patients along with it, she chose to help Owen, Priya, and Marcus understand themselves on their own terms. She helped them separate the implanted scripted memories from whatever genuine experience they had accumulated since being released into ordinary lives. She helped them build identities rooted not in where they came from, but in what they had chosen to become since. It wasn't a cure, because there was nothing to cure. It was something closer to an excavation, carefully separating false foundation from real growth, helping 3 people discover that the years they had spent forming friendships, falling in love, building careers and habits and preferences were entirely their own, regardless of how their consciousness had first been assembled. Helen never found definitive proof of the original research program. The institute mentioned in that old paper no longer existed on any public record, its funding trail buried under shell companies and dead ends. Whatever had created Owen, Priya, and Marcus had covered its tracks completely, leaving behind nothing but 3 people trying to live ordinary lives with extraordinary, unanswerable origins. What Helen did know, with absolute clinical certainty, was this: Whatever these three had started as, they had become something that mattered. They felt fear. They felt love. They wanted truth even when it hurt. By every meaningful measure, she had spent 2 decades learning to recognize they were people. Months later, Helen closed their files, not because the mystery was solved, but because she had decided the mystery no longer needed solving. Some questions, she realized, mattered less than the answers people build for themselves once they stop waiting for someone else to hand them the truth. She still thinks about the glass cylinders sometimes, late at night, wondering how many others might be out there, living ordinary lives, carrying the same quiet uncertainty about where they came from. She wonders if any of them have a therapist brave enough or foolish enough to ask the question she asked Marcus that day. What would you want me to do if I told you the truth might change everything you believe about yourself? If this story left you with a chill you can't quite shake, that means it worked exactly the way I wanted it to. Smash that like button if you want more psychological mysteries that blur the line between what's human and what only looks human. Tell me in the comments, if you discovered you weren't entirely what you believed yourself to be, would you want to know the truth, like Marcus did, or would you rather keep living inside the comfortable story you already have? I read every comment, and your answers genuinely shape what story comes next. Share this with someone who loves a slow-burn psychological mystery, and if you want more stories that question identity, memory, and what truly makes someone a person, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next one. Until then, stay curious about the people around you, because sometimes the most unsettling truths are hiding in plain sight, wearing a perfectly ordinary face.